I was watching musician Victor Wooten's video titled Music as a Language when researching for topics that related to music for this presentation. As a musician, I felt that music is more than just an art form, it is also a language. Victor Wooten seemed to support my opinion with this, as he stated that music is a language due to the fact that they both serve the same purpose. They are both means of expression. He said that they both can be used to communicate with others, can be read and written, and can make you laugh or cry, think or question. This brings out my main topic question. In what ways can music be considered a language? Before we analyze Wooten's classification of music as a language due to the fact that it makes you laugh, cry, think, and question, we must define language as a term. According to the TOK textbook written by Richard van de Lagemark, language is composed of three elements. First of all, it has to be rule-governed, with aspects such as grammar and vocabulary to it. Second of all, it must be intended, not accidental. This means that there must be an intended message that is being transmitted or communicated through language. Thirdly, and finally, language must be creative and open-ended. Our comprehension of language must enable us to create new sentences and to understand the message in new, unheard-of sentences. Based on these standards, music can be considered a language. First of all, it is rule-governed, as the musical scales, structures, songwriting structures, and so on tend to place rules upon music. While one might argue that expressionist music or other forms of music that ignore musical paradigms and structures are not rule-governed, the fundamental structure of music, which is that in Western music there are 12 different tones and different octaves, still remains the same. Music is also intended. Through lyrics, there tends to be an intended message. Even songs like the Beatles' I Am the Walrus, which John Lennon said meant nothing at all, had the meaning of meaning nothing, of mocking songs with a meaning. Through music, specific emotions are also created in order to communicate an idea or a feeling to the listener. This is very visible in classical music, which directly appeals to one's emotions without the necessity of including lyrics. Thirdly, music is creative and open-ended. By belonging in the arts, it must, by definition, have some form of creativity to it. The understanding of music can allow an artist to create new, unheard-of musical sentences in order to communicate different things. As listeners of music, once we are aware that music makes us feel and we take in messages and interpretations from the things we listen, we become open-ended to understand any new type of music that we hear, in the sense that we can conceive its message, even if the message we're hearing is something we've never heard in a song before. While this is supported by Wooten's statement that music is a language due to the fact that it allows for communication between individuals, I personally think that this definition of language might be too open-ended, as it doesn't incorporate the other classifications that Wooten gave towards language, those that involved emotion and thinking or questioning. Let's take an example from the natural sciences, for instance. The communication of monkeys through sign language, while it might be considered to be a form of language, isn't quite language in my opinion, but simply the exchange of information in order to obtain an immediate thing necessary for the monkey's daily survival and routines. In other words, if when humans talk to each other, they just talked about basic necessities and desires such as going to eat, drinking water, and so on, would we be inclined to call that language? Would we even be advanced enough in order to think about what language actually means? We must remember that, of course, language is a way of knowing. Can we really obtain information from language if it does not make us ponder about aspects beyond our simple necessities and desires? To put this into a knowledge question, to what degree is the knowledge obtained through language dependent of the relationship between language and other ways of knowing, such as emotion and reason? Let's look back at our original example for music as a language in order to examine this knowledge question. We managed to define music as a language due to the fact that, amongst other things, it transmits or communicates an intended message. We said that the message that music transmits for it to be a language is not only one that comes from lyrics, but also an emotional message that is transmitted through the sensations and atmosphere that the music gives the listener. This means that the knowledge we can obtain from language may be dependent on the fact that language must transmit some sort of emotional connection in order for individuals to fully understand a message and obtain language from it, as is the case with music. In regards to the relationship that reason has in strengthening the knowledge obtained through language, I believe that reason plays a central role in the knowledge that one can obtain from language, as transmitting reason through communication makes one, as Wooten said, think or question. While in the arts, one can easily make the case that a piece of music or painting can make the viewer think or question aspects about his own personal life or the society that surrounds him, one can see a more clear example in the field of mathematics that supports how reason is linked to language. To start seeing how important reason is for the obtaining of knowledge in language by looking at the mathematics, we can consider mathematician R.L.E. Schwarzenberger's quote about math as a language. My own attitude, which I share with many of my colleagues, is simply that mathematics is a language. Like English or Latin or Chinese, there are certain concepts for which mathematics is particularly well suited. It would be as foolish to attempt to write a love poem in the language of mathematics as to prove the fundamental theory of algebra using the English language. Now, to see if math fits in with our previous definition of language, we can apply Schwarzenberger's approach to the three language rules. First of all, math is rule-governed, with mathematical procedures, proofs, rules, and so on. Second of all, it is intended. When one conveys a mathematical expression, one intends to get something out at the end of that expression. Likewise, a mathematical problem intends a direct solution. Mathematical discoveries are always intentionally based upon other mathematical premises, meaning that even mathematical discoveries or expressions that might have accidentally emerged still transmit an inherently intentional mathematical message. Thirdly, math is also creative and open-ended in a sense. Its applications to the real world, and even to abstract concepts, make it able to communicate a range of ideas as broad as one can convey in a verbal language. While one might not be able to understand complex mathematical expressions with a basic understanding of the area, it is just as a child is unable to understand Shakespeare. Most importantly, perhaps, just as music was a language because it allowed for the transition of emotion and ideas that allowed knowledge to be explored by the listener, mathematics as a language is filled with reason and the transmission of reason. This description of math as a language shows that, above the guidelines expressed by van der Lagermaert for language, in order for language to convey knowledge, it must also be related to reason. For math to be able to transmit a message and be considered a language, mathematical expressions must be based on reason and must transmit reasonable ideas. Like I said before, though, that an area fits the guidelines expressed by the TOK course for language, in my opinion, doesn't necessarily make it language, as this definition of language is too open-ended. It is here where, in my opinion, math becomes a language not because of fitting into the before-mentioned guidelines, but because it allows for the transition of ideas that allow for critical thinking and reasoning, unlike how the sign language communication between monkeys didn't allow for the monkeys to reach a stage of critical reasoning. The reason why I think that this makes math a language is due to the fact that if reason wasn't transmitted through mathematical communication, then one would not be able to obtain knowledge from math if one looks at it from a language as a way of knowing perspective. That is, if mathematical expressions were meaningless numbers without any application to our reality or without anything to teach us, then how could we obtain knowledge from them as we communicate them? To simplify these findings into an answer for our previous knowledge question, I would say that the knowledge obtained through language is very dependent of the relationship between language, reason, and emotion, as the communication of emotion and reason-based messages are what allow for knowledge to be explored and obtained by an individual who receives such messages. In conclusion, what this means for our definition of language, at least judging the language standard set by the TOK textbook, is that for language to be fully able to transmit knowledge and allow for critical thinking instead of just thinking about basic necessities and desires, the ideas that are transmitted must have some emotional or reason-based component. However, by implying that language needs to have a connection with emotion or reason in order to be able to transmit knowledge, communication might be undermined as a means of expression, as some things we say or transmit might arguably not be relatable to emotion or reason. For instance, a son has a conversation with his parents about his day at school and speaks in a very monotonous tone and with a very expressionless face. One can say that, under this new definition of language, as there is no apparent reason or emotion behind his conversation, that there isn't really a transition of knowledge through language. I believe, however, that even the most prosaic conversations and messages allow for a reason or emotion-based reflection to be made. Unlike a monkey expressing his needs through sign language, this student is expressing his apathy through his expressionless conversation. While there are many scenarios that one can consider, it seems most appropriate to conclude that, for language to be appropriately considered as a tool through which we can transmit and express knowledge, there must be some sort of emotional or reason-based component attributed to it. While there are other areas of knowledge that could also be applied to this idea, such as sense perceptions, the reason why only emotion and reason were considered in this presentation was that they tend to be the most present factors in language-based interactions. Thus, for all intents and purposes, language also encompasses music and mathematics, as these clearly express an emotional or reason-based message that allows for knowledge to be explored once it's received.